I'm Madeline Brooks, 31 years old, an architect living in Boise, Idaho. That Sunday night, at what should have been a cozy family dinner at my parents' house, my world turned upside down. Picture this: the dining room table set with Mum's old floral plates, the smell of her slow-cooked pot roast filling the air, and my parents, Richard and Cynthia, sitting across from me. My sister Tessa was there too, next to her husband, Gavin Holt, both of them looking a little too smug for a casual family meal. The mashed potatoes sat untouched. Then my dad leaned forward, his voice sharp as a blade. "Madeline," he said, his eyes not meeting mine. "You can stay in the basement." "Or leave." I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth. Tessa chimed in, her tone dripping with something close to glee. "Come on, Madeline, you don't need that big room upstairs. We're moving in." Gavin flashed a tight smile, his polished watch catching the light. My heart pounded. I'd been pouring my paychecks into this house: electricity, plumbing repairs, even the new dining table we were sitting at. And now they were treating me like some guest who'd overstayed her welcome. I tried to speak, my voice shaky. "Hold on, I've paid for half this house. The bills, the roof repairs, the dishwasher in the kitchen, I bought all of it." I looked at Mum, hoping for a flicker of support, but she just stared at her plate, twisting her napkin. Dad waved me off. "It's decided, Madeline. Tessa and Gavin need the space more." Tessa smirked, leaning closer to Gavin, who nodded like he'd just closed a deal. The anger surged in my chest, hot and heavy. I stood up, my chair scraping the floor. "Fine," I said, my voice steadier now. "I'm gone." That night I packed everything I'd paid for: my flat-screen TV, the leather armchair, even the fancy air purifier I'd gotten for Mum's allergies. Tessa laughed as I hauled the stuff to my car. "Really, Madeline? The armchair?" I didn't answer. I slammed the trunk, drove off, and watched the house shrink in my rearview mirror. A few days later, my phone buzzed. It was Mum, her voice thin and trembling. In the background, I heard Tessa shouting, her words sharp with panic. "Mom, tell me she's lying!" The chaos poured through the phone, just as I was starting to piece my life back together. "And what happened next?" "Well, it flipped their world upside down. Before I go on, tell me, where are you watching this?" What city, what time? I'd love to know how far my story's travelled, and who's out there listening. 3 years ago, I moved back into my parents' house in Boise, Idaho, not because I wanted to, but because they needed me. My dad, Richard, had owned a small construction company, but when the pandemic hit, his contracts dried up. Bills piled up faster than they could handle: mortgage payments, water heaters that kept breaking, a roof that leaked every spring. I'm an architect, 31 now, and back then, I was pulling in a decent salary designing office spaces and community centres. So I stepped in. I told myself it was temporary, just to keep the family afloat. My paychecks went straight to the house. I covered the mortgage when Dad couldn't, paid for a new water heater when the old one gave out, and even replaced the drafty windows with energy-efficient ones. I was working 55, sometimes 60 hours a week, sketching blueprints late into the night, meeting clients across town. It was exhausting, but I thought I was doing the right thing.
For family, you know.
But it never felt like enough. Dad would take the checks I handed him, give a quick nod, and then turn his attention to my sister, Tessa. Tessa, my older sister by 2 years, had a knack for dreaming big and falling short. She'd tried everything: a boutique selling handmade scarves, a food blog that never took off, an e-commerce app that crashed after 3 months. Every time she failed, she'd come back to Dad with a new idea, all charm and big promises. And he'd eat it up, calling her our visionary. My contributions? Barely a footnote. I once overheard Mum Cynthia say to Dad, "Madeline's just here to help, Richard. Tessa's the one with real ambition." It cut deep, like I was just the bank, not their daughter. Then Tessa met Gavin Holt. She brought him to dinner one night, all smiles. introducing him as a venture capitalist with a slick haircut and a suit that looked way too expensive for Boise. Mum and Dad couldn't stop gushing, how sharp he was, how he had his act together. Gavin pulled up in a shiny Tesla, his watch glinting under the chandelier. I didn't buy it. Venture capital in Boise? The math wasn't mathing. Most guys like him were in Silicon Valley, not here. I tried asking about his work, clients, deals, the usual, but he'd dodge, flashing a grin and changing the subject to some big project he was closing. Tessa would beam, hanging on his every word. I started noticing things. Gavin would show up with shopping bags from high-end stores, places I couldn't afford even with overtime. Once he flashed a new phone, top-of-the-line leather case, the works, calling it a business expense. Tessa didn't question it. She just bragged about his hustle. Dad would clap him on the back, saying, "You picked a winner, Tessa." Meanwhile, my salary was stretched thin, keeping the house running. I mentioned it to Mum once, asking if anyone else thought Gavin's lifestyle seemed off. She just shrugged. "He's successful, Madeline. Don't be so suspicious. It wasn't just the money." Gavin had this way of steering every conversation, like he was pitching a deal. He'd talk about startups, dropping buzzwords like disruptive innovation and scaling fast, and Dad's eyes would light up. Tessa would nod along, like she was part of the plan. I'd try to chime in, maybe mention the new furnace I'd paid for or the property taxes I'd cleared, but Dad would cut me off. "Let's hear about Gavin's next venture," he'd say. It was like I was invisible unless a bill needed paying. Once, I caught Gavin glancing at me during dinner, a smirk flickering across his face, like he knew he had them all wrapped around his finger. Tessa wasn't much better. She'd borrow my laptop without asking, saying she needed it for business research. Dad would tell me to pitch in more around the house, even though I was already covering most of it. Mum stayed quiet, fussing with her knitting or wiping down counters, avoiding my eyes. I started keeping a tally in my head. Every dollar I spent on that house, every weekend I gave up fixing pipes instead of living my own life. Hundreds of thousands over the years, and for what? Lying awake at night in my old bedroom, I'd stare at the ceiling, wondering why my efforts didn't matter. Something about Gavin, his polished confidence, his two perfect answers, kept gnawing at me. I couldn't shake the feeling he was playing a bigger game, one that might cost us more than just my place at the table. That Sunday evening, I walked into my parents' dining room in Boise, expecting nothing more than Mum's pot roast and some small talk. The table was set with her old floral china, the kind she only used for special occasions. The smell of roasted carrots and garlic hung in the air, warm and familiar. I slid into my usual chair, forcing a smile as Dad Richard carved the meat with his steady hands. Mum, Cynthia, fussed with the napkins, her fingers twitching like she was nervous about something. I didn't think much of it, until the front door slammed open. Tessa burst in, dragging 2 oversized suitcases, her husband Gavin trailing behind with a sleek leather duffel slung over his shoulder. "We're moving in," Tessa announced, her voice bright but sharp like she was daring anyone to argue. Gavin flashed that polished smile of his loafers clicking on the hardwood floor. My stomach twisted. This wasn't a visit. This was something else. I looked at Dad, waiting for him to say something, anything. But he just kept carving, not even glancing up. "Madeline," he said, his tone flat, like he was reading a grocery list. "You can stay in the basement. Or leave." My fork froze mid-air. "What?" I managed, my throat tightening. Tessa leaned back in her chair, smirking. "Come on, Madeline. You don't need that big room upstairs. We're starting something big here." Gavin nodded, his eyes scanning the room like he was already measuring it for new furniture. I felt the heat rising in my chest, years of frustration bubbling up like a storm. "Hold on," I said, my voice sharper than I meant it to be. "I've been paying for this house. The electricity, the plumbing repairs, the mortgage payments. I bought the dining table we're sitting at, the new furnace, even the paint on these walls." I turned to Dad, searching for some flicker of acknowledgement, but he just sighed, like I was being difficult. "It's time for you to step back, Madeline," he said. "Tessa and Gavin need the room more. They've got plans. I wanted to scream. Tessa's plans never lasted longer than a season. Her boutique folded, her app crashed, her blog went nowhere. And I was the one keeping this family's head above water." Gavin leaned forward, his grin widening. "You're not exactly essential here, Madeline," he said, his tone cutting. "You're just... here." Tessa stifled a laugh, covering her mouth with a manicured hand, her nails catching the light. I clenched my fists under the table, my nails digging into my palms. "Not essential?" I shot back, my voice cracking but loud. "I've poured hundreds of thousands of dollars into this house. I've missed out on projects, worked weekends fixing leaks, all to keep this roof over your heads." "What have you done, Tessa?" I stared at her, waiting for an answer, but she just rolled her eyes. Dad slammed his hand on the table, making the glasses rattle. "Enough," he barked. "This isn't about you. They're family and they're staying. End of story." Mom looked down, twisting her napkin into knots, saying nothing. I stared at her, begging for a glance, a word, anything to show she saw me. But she just sat there, silent as always. Tessa leaned against Gavin, whispering something that made him chuckle. The room felt like it was closing in, the air thick with their dismissal. I pushed my chair back, the screech piercing the silence. "I'm not doing this," I said, standing up. "If I'm not wanted, I'm gone." I stormed upstairs, my heart pounding like a drum. I grabbed a duffel bag and started packing. Clothes, my laptop, a few sketchbooks from my architecture projects. Then I went to the living room and unplugged the flat-screen TV I'd bought last Christmas. I dragged the leather armchair I'd paid for to the front door. Tessa followed, laughing. "You're taking the armchair?" "Really, Madeline?" I ignored her, hauling my things to the car. Dad stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "You're making a scene," he said, his voice low. I didn't answer. I loaded the last box, slammed the trunk and drove off, the house fading in my rearview mirror. I wasn't just leaving a room. I was done carrying them all. The hum of downtown Boise was a shock to my system after the quiet of my parents' suburban street. I'd found a small one-bedroom apartment near the heart of the city, thanks to Lena, a co-worker from my architecture firm who'd become more than just a colleague. She'd texted me the listing the day after I left, her message simple but firm. "Madeline, you deserve your own space. Come check this out." The apartment wasn't much. A cozy living room, a tiny kitchen, and a window overlooking the Boise River, but it was mine. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. Lena stopped by that first night, her warm laugh filling the bare space as we unpacked boxes. My salvaged TV sat in the corner, and the leather armchair I'd dragged from my parents' house looked oddly at home against the blank walls. "You need to get out of York's system, your head, Madeline," Lena said, tossing me a flyer for an outdoor painting group she'd joined. "It's not just art, it's a way to reset." I wasn't convinced, but her energy was infectious, so I promised I'd try it. The next weekend, I showed up to the painting group at Julia Davis Park, feeling out of place with my cheap watercolour set and rusty sketching skills. The group was small, a mix of locals who painted the river's edge or the park's old trees under the morning sun. I fumbled through my first canvas, but there was something calming about mixing colours and focusing on the world outside my head. Lena was right. It wasn't just art. It was a chance to feel like me again, not the daughter paying bills or the sister pushed aside. I started going every Saturday, my paintings getting a little better each time, my heart a little lighter. I also took up running, something I'd never had time for before. Early mornings I'd jog along the Boise River greenbelt, the water sparkling under the dawn light, the rhythm of my steps drowning out the noise in my mind. Lena would join me sometimes, her chatter about work or her latest dating flop, making me laugh in a way I hadn't in months. She wasn't just a friend, she was an anchor, someone who saw me for who I was, not what I could do for her. But even as I settled into this new life, I couldn't shake the unease about Gavin. His Tesla, his designer clothes, the way he always had cash to burn, it didn't add up. I'd lie awake at night, replaying his slick smiles and Tessa's blind devotion. Something was off, and it wasn't just my pride talking. I felt it in my gut like a shadow I couldn't outrun. I didn't know it then, but that feeling was about to lead me somewhere I never expected. The more I thought about Gavin, the more his polished exterior seemed like a mask. His Tesla, those designer suits, the way he tossed around money like it was nothing, it didn't make sense for a so-called venture capitalist in Boise. I'd spent years crunching numbers for my architecture projects, and I knew when something didn't add up. So one evening, sitting in my apartment with a cup of coffee and my laptop, I decided to do some digging. I started with a call to Carter, an old friend from college who now worked in finance in Seattle. We'd bonded years ago over late-night study sessions, and I trusted his instincts. "Carter, it's Madeline," I said when he picked up, his voice warm but curious. "I need a favour. Have you ever heard of Gavin Holt?" I described Gavin, his big talk about investments, the flashy lifestyle, Tessa's blind faith in him. Carter went quiet for a moment, then said, "Holt's name has come up. His firm's on a watch list for shady deals, fake startup funds, money moving through shell companies. Nothing's been proven, but he's not clean, Madeline." My heart sank, but I wasn't surprised. I thanked Carter and hung up, my mind racing. If Gavin was trouble, my family was in deeper than I'd feared. I tried calling Dad, hoping he'd listen for once. "Dad, you need to hear this," I started, laying out what Carter had told me about Gavin's firm. His response was a low grunt. "Don't meddle in their business, Madeline," he said, his voice sharp. "Tessa and Gavin are doing fine. Focus on your own life." I pushed harder, mentioning the investigation, but he cut me off. "Enough, let it go." The line went dead. I stared at my phone, frustration burning in my chest. Dad's stubborn loyalty to Tessa was nothing new, but it still stung. I called Mum next, hoping she'd be different. "Mum, please, just listen," I said, explaining the red flags about Gavin. She sighed, her voice soft but firm. "Madeline, don't stir up trouble. Tessa's happy. That's what matters." I wanted to scream. How could they be so blind? But I knew arguing was pointless. Mum never challenged Dad or Tessa. I hung up, feeling more alone than ever, but more determined to find answers. I reached out to old contacts from my architecture network. A former client, Jenna, who now worked in corporate law, responded to my email within hours. "Gavin's firm has a trail of complaints," she wrote. "Dodgy investments, inflated valuations, even whispers of money laundering. Be careful, Madeline." Another contact, a surveyor I'd worked with, mentioned hearing gossip at a local bank about Gavin pushing questionable deals through Boise startups. Every piece of information tightened the knot in my stomach. This wasn't just suspicion anymore. I was sure Gavin was hiding something big. I started scouring public records online, something I'd learned to do for property projects at work. I found 3 startup investments listed under Gavin's name, all tied to companies that dissolved within months, with investors claiming fraud. One record caught my eye. A second mortgage on my parents' house signed just weeks ago, with Gavin's name next to Dad's. The loan was for $300,000, funneled to a company linked to Gavin's firm. My hands shook as I read it. The house I'd poured my savings into, the one I'd fought to keep standing, was now a pawn in his game. I texted Carter again, asking him to keep an ear out for anything new. He promised to dig deeper. Meanwhile, I threw myself into my new routine. Work, painting sessions at Julia Davis Park, runs along the Boise River. The city felt like a fresh start, but the weight of my family's dismissal clung to me. I couldn't stop wondering how far Gavin's schemes reached. Was Tessa in on it, or was she just another pawn? I didn't know yet, but I was about to find out. A few weeks later, I ran into Evelyn, an old family friend, at a downtown coffee shop. She was sipping tea at a corner table, her silver hair pulled back in a neat braid. "Madeline, it's been too long," she said, waving me over. We chatted about small things, her garden, my new apartment, but when I mentioned Tessa's husband, Evelyn's smile faded. "Gavin Holt?" she asked, her voice low. I knew him in Portland years ago. He worked for a startup fund that got sued for siphoning investor money. He slipped out before the hammer fell, but he was in deep. My pulse quickened. This wasn't just rumours. It was a piece of the puzzle I'd been chasing. I drove to my parents' house that afternoon, my hands gripping the steering wheel. Tessa was in the driveway, unloading groceries, looking as smug as ever. I didn't waste time. "We need to talk," I said, pulling out my phone to show her Jenna's email about Gavin's firm. "He's not who you think, Tessa. His company's being investigated for fraud. Evelyn told me he was part of a scam in Portland." Tessa's face darkened. She snatched the phone, scanned the email, then shoved it back at me. "You're just jealous," she spat. "Gavin's killing it and you can't handle it. Stop making things up." I stared at her, stunned. "This isn't about me," I said. "This is about Gavin putting our family at risk." She laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "Go play detective somewhere else, Madeline." Inside, Mom was chopping vegetables in the kitchen. I tried again, keeping my voice steady. "Mum, Evelyn knew Gavin in Portland. He was tied to a scam. You need to check what he's doing with the house." Mum's knife paused, but she didn't look up. "Madeline, don't start trouble," she said softly. "Tessa's happy. Let it be." I walked out, the weight of their denial pressing down on me. But I wasn't done. Gavin thought he could fool everyone, but I'd seen through him from the start. And I wasn't going to let him take everything we'd built. A few weeks after my run-in with Tessa, the pieces of Gavin's puzzle were starting to form a picture I couldn't ignore. I was sitting in my apartment, sketching blueprints for a new community centre, when my phone buzzed with a call from Mum. Her voice was barely a whisper, shaky and raw. "Madeline, there are people here," she said. "They're asking for Gavin." My heart skipped a beat. I grabbed my keys and drove to my parents' house, the Boise streets blurring past as my mind raced. When I pulled up, 2 investigators stood in the driveway, their badges catching the fading porch light. Dad, Richard, was at the door, his face pale, while Tessa paced behind him, clutching her phone like it was a lifeline. "This is about some investment deals," one investigator said, holding up a folder thick with papers. "We need to speak with Gavin Holt. He's linked to fraudulent transactions, fake startups, laundered funds." Tessa's eyes widened, her voice cracking.
"Mom, tell me he didn't do this,"
she shouted, turning to Cynthia, who stood frozen in the hallway, her hands trembling. The investigators explained that Gavin had used Tessa's name on several shady deals, including a second mortgage on the house tied to a shell company. Dad stepped forward, his voice shaking. "He's not here right now," he said, taking their card with a warning they'd be back. I stayed quiet, watching it all unfold, my pulse hammering. As the investigators drove off, I spotted Gavin's Tesla parked across the street. He hadn't seen me yet. I crossed the road, my phone already recording in my pocket, my hands steady despite the fire in my chest. "Gavin," I called, my voice calm but firm. He froze, his eyes darting to the house, then back to me. "What's this about, Madeline?" he asked, his tone sharp like he was sizing me up. I didn't flinch. "I know about the mortgage, the shell company, the money you've been moving," I said. "You've been using my family. Tell me the truth." His face twisted, but he didn't run. For a moment he just stared, then let out a cold laugh. "Fine," he snapped. "I used the house as collateral for a deal. Your dad signed off on it, no questions asked. Tessa was too busy playing happy wife to notice." I pressed the phone harder against my pocket, catching every word. "You drained their savings," I said, my voice steady. "You played them." He smirked, unapologetic. "They trusted me, Madeline. That's on them." Before I could say another word, he jumped into his Tesla and sped off, tyres screeching against the asphalt. I stood there, the weight of his confession sinking in like a stone. Back at the house, Tessa was unravelling. "How could he do this?" she muttered, running her hands through her hair, her eyes red. She turned to me, her voice desperate. "Madeline, you knew something was wrong. Why didn't you stop him?" I stared at her, incredulous. "I tried, Tessa," I said, my words sharp. "I told you, I told Mom, I told Dad. You called me jealous. You all shut me out." Mom looked away, her silence louder than ever. Dad sank into a chair, his hands covering his face, the investigator's papers still scattered on the table. Then came the twist that hit me harder than Gavin's confession. Among the documents, I found a contract with Tessa's signature, authorising a transfer of funds from my parents' savings to one of Gavin's accounts. I turned to her, my voice low. "You knew, didn't you?" Tessa's face crumpled, tears spilling over. "I didn't know everything," she whispered. "He said it was for our future. I thought he loved me." She'd signed the papers, not asking questions, too caught up in Gavin's promises to see the truth. My sister, the one I'd grown up with, hadn't just been fooled. She'd been part of the lie. I walked out, my phone burning in my pocket with Gavin's recorded confession. I'd warned them, fought for them, but they'd chosen Tessa and Gavin over me. Now they were tangled in his mess, and I was done cleaning it up. The next morning, I drove back to my parents' house in Boise, the air heavy with the kind of quiet that follows a storm. The front yard was still, the porch light flickering from the night before. Inside, the dining room table was a mess of papers, bank notices, loan agreements, a foreclosure warning glaring in bold red ink. Dad, Richard, sat at the head of the table, his shoulders slumped, looking older than I'd ever seen him. He handed me a folder from the bank, his hands trembling. "It's bad, Madeleine," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I opened the folder, my architect's brain kicking in as I scanned the numbers. The second mortgage Gavin had orchestrated was for $300,000, with no payments made. Worse, their savings account, once holding nearly $150,000 for retirement, was drained, transferred to a shell company tied to Gavin's firm. The house I'd poured my heart and savings into, the one I'd kept standing through years of late-night paychecks and weekend repairs, was now a financial sinkhole, weeks away from foreclosure. Tessa slumped on the couch, her eyes red and swollen. "Madeline, you've got to help us," she said, her voice cracking. "The bank's coming for everything. We're broke." I looked at her, the sister who'd mocked me at that dinner, who'd signed off on Gavin's schemes and called me jealous when I tried to warn her. "Help you?" I said, my tone cold, sharper than I meant it to be. "You told me I wasn't essential, Tessa. You and Dad pushed me out, told me to take the basement or leave. I left, and now you want my money to fix this?" She flinched, her lips trembling, but pressed on. "We're family," she said, her voice small. "You can't just walk away." Dad stood by the window, staring out at the street. "I messed up, Madeline," he said, his voice low, heavy with regret. "I trusted Gavin. I thought he and Tessa had it all figured out. I was wrong." His admission hit me like a punch, but it wasn't enough. For years I'd carried this family, paying bills, fixing leaks, missing out on my own life, only to be sidelined for Tessa's empty dreams and Gavin's lies. "You didn't just trust him, Dad," I said, my voice steady despite the ache in my chest. "You chose him over me. You chose Tessa's fantasy over my reality. I can't fix that." Mom Cynthia came in from the kitchen, her face streaked with tears. "Madeline, please," she said, her voice trembling. "We're going to lose everything, the house, our savings, all of it." She reached for my hand, but I pulled back. Her silence during that dinner, her refusal to hear my warnings, hurt as much as Dad's dismissal. "You didn't listen, Mom," I said. "I tried to tell you about Gavin, but you told me to let it go." Now you're asking me to save you." She sobbed, covering her face, but her tears couldn't undo the years of being overlooked. I walked through the house, my eyes tracing the traces of my contributions, the new windows I'd paid for, the furnace I'd replaced, the walls I'd painted. It was all at risk now, tangled in Gavin's fraud. The bank notices warned of foreclosure within weeks if the loan wasn't addressed. Tessa had no job, just excuses. Dad's pension wouldn't touch the debt, and Mum's part-time gig at a local bookstore barely covered groceries. They were staring down a cliff, and for the first time, I realised I couldn't fix it, not because I didn't have the means, but because I didn't owe them that sacrifice. I left the house, the weight of their desperation lingering like a fog. Back in my apartment, I played Gavin's recorded confession again, his cold voice admitting to the scam. I'd sent it to the investigators, hoping it would help their case, but it wouldn't bring back the money or the house. My family was fractured, not just by Gavin's betrayal, but by years of taking me for granted. I wasn't going back to carry their burdens anymore. A year later, I'm sitting in my Boise apartment, sunlight streaming through the window, warming the sketches and blueprints scattered across my desk. My little one-bedroom has become a home, filled with touches that feel like me. A mid-century coffee table I found at a local flea market, a bookshelf packed with art books and novels, and a small canvas from my painting group hanging by the door. I've been promoted at my architecture firm, leading the design for a new community centre downtown, a project that stretched my creativity and reminded me why I love what I do. The raise was nice too, enough to buy a proper easel for my weekend painting sessions. Lena, my co-worker turned best friend, has been my rock. We meet up for runs along the Boise River Greenbelt, our sneakers pounding the path as we talk about everything from work deadlines to her latest baking experiments. She's the one who pushed me to join a local running club, where I've met people who make me laugh and feel seen. I started a blog too, nothing fancy, just a place to write about my journey, leaving my family, setting boundaries, finding peace. The comments from readers, strangers who've faced their own family struggles, have been a quiet kind of comfort, like I'm not alone anymore. I heard through a mutual friend that my family lost the house. The bank foreclosed after too many missed payments, and they moved to a cramped rental apartment on the edge of Boise. Tessa's working part-time at a coffee shop, her confidence shattered after Gavin's betrayal. He was arrested a few months ago, caught in a sting operation tied to his fraudulent deals. Tessa filed for divorce, but not before sending me a few desperate texts, asking for money or a place to stay. I didn't reply. Dad's been driving for a rideshare app, his pride worn thin. Mum's cleaning houses now, her hands rough from the work. Their savings are gone, their lives upended by the choices they made and the lies they believed. Dad left voicemails a few times, his voice softer than I'd ever heard. "Madeline, we need you," he said once, his words breaking. I didn't call back. Mum sent a letter, a single page of apologies, her handwriting shaky. It sits unopened on my kitchen counter. For years I gave everything to that family, my money, my time, my dreams, only to be pushed aside for Tessa's illusions and Gavin's cons. Cutting them off wasn't easy. It hurt, like losing a piece of myself, but it was necessary. Here's the lesson I've learned, the one I want to share with you. Family isn't just blood. It's the people who see you, who value you, who stand by you when you're at your lowest. Lena became that for me, showing up with a smile and a coffee when I needed it most. My running club, my painting group, they're my family now, not because of obligation, but because of choice. Setting boundaries wasn't about shutting my family out. It was about guarding my heart, my time, my peace. It was about learning that I'm enough, just as I am. I think about that dinner sometimes, the way my fork froze in the air, the way my family chose Gavin's lies over my truth. It broke me, but it also built me. Walking away showed me my own strength, my own worth. I'm not perfect, and my life isn't either, but I'm happy because I chose myself. Thank you for following my story, for sitting through the betrayal, the heartbreak, and the redemption. It's not easy to draw a line with the people you love, but sometimes it's the only way to save yourself. Have you ever had to set boundaries with your family? What did you learn from it? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your stories. Let's talk about what it means to stand up for ourselves, even when it hurts.